All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for making the time. I have the pleasure of introducing Patrick Heim here. It goes without saying that in our industry, peer conversations, collaboration, as well as mentoring are absolutely a necessity. I have the pleasure of having Patrick as both a peer as well as a mentor. He's got over 2 decades of experience in the cybersecurity industry, as a true visionary and leader in that field. And he is both a co-founder and partner of 2 different venture capital funds that are focused on cybersecurity. One is called Sin Ventures. The other one is called Clear Sky. And brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise around investing in transformative security companies, both emerging tech and seed A round. His career includes executive roles at prominent, well-known companies such as Dropbox, Salesforce, Kaiser Permanente, and McKesson. And he's consistently demonstrated his ability to drive innovation and implement cutting-edge strategies at each one of those companies and more. Today, he's going to talk about emerging technology, both from an investor as well as CISO perspective. And hopefully we have lots of questions that we can wrap up on toward the end of the session. But Patrick, I'll turn the stage over to you. And thank you once again for making the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, Robin. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully, you guys aren't bored about all this AI stuff by now on the agenda, because I'm going to talk about more AI stuff, which I think is pretty unavoidable. In any case, let's make sure you guys can see my screen. And does that look good?
You're good? Yep.
All right, awesome. So what I want to talk about is maybe take a bit of an investor lens to this. And let me see if I can get it to advance. There we go. Innovation ecosystem. Um, when we think about kind of like as buyers, what's happening in cybersecurity, and if I roll back to like maybe even just 7, 8, 10 years ago or so, the big platform players we had, the Symantec's, the McAfee's, the Network Associates, they were all kind of incompetent. I hate to say it, So if you were going to build a cutting edge cybersecurity program, you really didn't have any alternative but to go to a bunch of startup companies that had very specialized technology, were best in class for their own specific product. And the reality is that obviously created a market opportunity. People saw that. And what we've seen over the last probably 7, 8 years is that there's a fluctuation, depending how you count them, between 3 to 5,000 different security vendors out there, which is kind of intolerable. And what's happening is that even though these companies like the CrowdStrikes and the Palo Altos have gotten quite big as public companies, I believe there's kind of an immutable law when it comes to innovation. And this isn't just with regards to cybersecurity, it's in general, that at a certain size, unless you break away a specific group, I think like the Skunkworks team or whatever it is, in general, large companies just don't innovate. And it's the nature of being a large company. It's the nature of having process. Who knows, maybe Elon's going to break that cycle since he likes to disrupt his own large companies quite a bit. But in general, so maybe I call it a theory, not a law, but it's like it's inversely proportional. Large companies don't innovate very well. And that means that they have to acquire innovation. And this is something that we've seen very much in not only the technology space, but also in areas like pharmaceuticals, where large pharma companies, quite frankly, don't do poor research on a lot of the drugs that they develop. They really just kind of acquire promising startup companies that have done that research already. And when I think about what it takes as a CISO to kind of like figure out what are the Lego blocks that I'm going to purchase, putting aside what I'm going to build myself. It's like I have this formula I put up there. It's basically the risk I'm dealing with times the pain that's associated with the vulnerability that I have or the issue I have divided by kind of the cost and time. I don't know if that makes sense. It kind of makes sense to me, but the net of it is that somebody once asked me kind of what's the role of the CISO, and I had to think for a second. I think it's just to prioritize because we're overwhelmed with a large number of risks, almost like an infinite attack surface, and we're also overwhelmed with solutions. So, this leads me in that when we look at cybersecurity solutions from a buyer perspective, we have to think about how do we manage all of that chaos. And, the reason I mentioned the large competent platform vendors, and I may get back to that a little bit later, is that they didn't used to be an option, but I actually think we can kind of get to 80-20, meaning that 80% of all your security needs are taken care of by the large platform vendors. But there is still a lot of room for security innovation. And I actually believe that AI is going to change an awful lot about security innovation in general and what's prioritized in various companies. And I think every element, like I bolted and highlighted, if I bold and highlight something, it probably means that you should read it. I think every element is about to be disrupted in cybersecurity. So, what does it actually look like from, why do we have these 5,000 some companies or so? It generally starts that you have a gifted team of entrepreneurs. They start a company, the company matures, and they prove themselves from a technology and market perspective. And then some big company, like we just mentioned, let's pick on CrowdStrike for a second. They say, this is a really great technology. And they acquire this firm for strategic reasons, team, tech, or revenue. And the reason I break this out is because the reasons can vary significantly. If you're a CrowdStrike, you generally tend to acquire for the technology. You see a very strong technology fit with your own core technology, and you think that if we take this tech, we can add it into our product and we can multiply it and we can sell the hell out of it and make money. Whereas strategic reasons might be, if you look at Palo Alto, they may spend less effort in terms of integration of the product. But what they can do is basically push it into their sales teams, create a SKU for it relatively fast, and then go out and sell it. Whereas a team-based acquisition, in combination with some of the others, might be if you look at Wiz recently acquiring a company called Gem Security, they flat out said is like this was a team thing, it was an amazing cultural fit, amazing team. They're going to be able to integrate them very fast, and they had the same culture of engineering and whatnot. And then the last case is kind of like revenue reasons, meaning that the acquisition is that we're kind of going to miss the quarter, so we should acquire a company that's going to boost our revenue numbers so we make the quarter. Believe it or not, that actually happens. So any case, I spent way too much time in bullet point 3 here. But what's really interesting is then startup personnel, the real gifted innovators of these companies, they tend to stick around for a couple of years. They have their vesting period where generally there's an incentive plan to retain them and other key members of the team. But it's pretty rare that once that vesting period is done, if you're somebody who has the entrepreneurial spirit, you're going to get the hell out of here. You're basically going to leave. You're going to start your next company, and all of a sudden the cycle repeats itself. And we actually see a fair number of cases where we have multiple CEOs, and as an investor, multiple time CEOs. And as an investor, it's amazing because if we treat them right and get them to a great exit the first time around, they'll come back to us. And we have actually several companies in our portfolio where we have CEOs that have done business with us as a venture capital firm that have come back to us. But this is an important ecosystem to understand. The unfortunate side effect sometimes is that, especially through the acquisition cycle, customers, you were out there buying a really cool, shiny product, and then all of a sudden you get a note the company's been acquired, and it's like, oh crap, I didn't necessarily want to do business with a company that acquired them. Yeah, it happens. The other thing to think about is, and we kind of talked about this whole cybersecurity ecosystem is this big fish eats small fish. And, it's like, please don't pay attention to the dates. I recycle the slide because I'm lazy. But what was interesting is the right-hand corner here is that cybersecurity M&A, there were 36 deals done just in August 2024. So you may not have a lot of visibility into what's happening, but this is a relatively active market. It's getting more active. Obviously, COVID screwed things up. Some of the economic challenges screwed things up. And when I say screwed things up, it both slowed down the rate of acquisition for the buyers, having to be more cautious around the acquisitions they make, as well as what happened was there were a fair number of venture-funded startup companies that basically started running out of cash. So right now, it's very much of a buyer's market where you have companies that are unfortunately somewhat desperate to find an exit because they haven't been able to get the velocity they wanted, again, being 1 out of 3,000, 1 out of 5,000. And their cash is running low and their options have run down. So right now, this number of 36 deals in August doesn't surprise me. It's very much of a buyer's market. Good for buyers, not so great for investors and startup founders. So getting into kind of like the AI side of things, this is not a all extensive list. I did spend some time recently meeting with the security leaders of two large AI companies to understand what they're working on. And surprisingly, one of them was like their highest priority is like the first bullet point. It's like they're in there trying to figure out maybe less on the Skynet side, but how do they prevent the abuse of their platforms? And bioweapons was definitely called out. I mean, think about, if you have something that does very sophisticated protein folding analysis, whatnot. I'm not talking about like the LLM type of a model, but something actually used for biology. It's like, hey, buddy, build me a virus that targets a specific ethnic group. Like, that's kind of horrible. So, there's a dark side to this. And flipping the safety element is also really important, which is like, how do you make sure there's actually trustworthy output, that it's not hallucinating, which is a big problem, and that basically you can actually rely on these systems for doing significant, for conducting real business and making real decisions on. Securing AI is kind of interesting. We've seen a lot of companies as an investor that in the first, probably like starting 3 to 4 years ago, that were focused on defending the models. They were creating almost like fuzzers that attack models that you build, looking for ability to manipulate on those models and give you the ability of obviously hardening those. It's a very interesting space. I'm not sure, it's like if I were to ask you guys to raise your hand, how many of you actually were to say this is a top priority for us? I think it's been very slow in coming because the attackers aren't quite there yet. They're quite frankly still getting fat, dumb, and happy in terms of making money, doing traditional things that don't involve very sophisticated attacks against AI models right now. But I would imagine it's more of a nation state issue. And then we see a lot of startup companies that I put them in the bucket of operational security for AI, where you have a focus on, well, how do I put in place controls that monitor my employees so they're not putting PII out there or confidential code that's being developed in-house? And how do I even scrub the output on making sure that we have some semblance of access controls? One of the larger challenges out there is that some of these models are basically trained on massive data sets. And now you make that model available, and that data set or combination of data sets may have had fine-grained access controls in the past, but now that it's used to train the model, it's all one big blob. So the ability, you kind of lost and filtered out an element of fine-grained access controls in these models. So this is still, I think, an ongoing challenge, and we see a lot of companies trying to innovate in that space, creating proxy-like products and whatnot. Probably more near-term market demand, but we're kind of scratching our heads on this, trying to figure out how much is that going to be a standalone product space versus something where it's going to be a feature developed by existing security vendors eventually. And then I would say the last thing that AI is really obviously going to change, especially in security, is really just automation and the ability to summarize vast amounts of information, to do research, do data enrichment that would have otherwise taken lots of individuals, manual work, scripts, whatever. That is changing at an extraordinarily rapid pace. And then going forward from that, there's this term agentic, which is the cool new Silicon Valley term that everybody has to drop in every meeting at least once a day, which is basically having AI agents that they'll actually take action. So it's not just passive reporting, it's automation through AI. And that has some very interesting implications for, especially for security operations and SOCs in the near future. If we flip forward, so I guess you probably didn't understand, but this is an economy and philosophy lesson today. So let's start with like two graphs. Actually, I'm going to start with the oh shit gap here. At least I call it that. And this is something that struck me when I was reading a book called The Singularity is Near. And I forgot the freaking author's name right now. I apologize deeply. But the key point that he made in the book discussing the improvement of AI technology is that humans think in linear progress. So if you look at that flat line that says linear, basically, and I say happily predictable, that's how humans perceive progress. And then the curved line is really what we believe we're seeing with the improvement in AI right now. And there is this area I call the zone of disappointment. This is basically when AI is below our expectations from a linear perspective, meaning it's like, well, this shit isn't real. It's not a big deal. And then all of a sudden there's this crossing point where all of a sudden, this AI stuff is kind of real. And that was probably 2 to 3 years ago with, ChatGPT going out there in a very big way. And now all of a sudden, I think we're closer to this exponential, being on this exponential curve, and we're in this disruption space where all of a sudden the capabilities of AI systems are actually much higher than where we anticipated them to be. And that's the oh shit moment. And I said I had some discussions with interesting leaders in the AI space, and one of them basically said that right now, within a certain number of domains, not in every domain, AI is performing at an equivalence level to a normal human being, basically. In many cases, many times faster. He predicts that within 3 to 5 years, at the latest, basically, we're going to see AI operating basically with and matching virtually all the experts that are out there. In other words, in the next 3 years, it's not going to be as much around automation. It's going to be really around. It's going to be really around. It will have true expert capabilities and knowledge that we don't have. Maybe even generating new IP. And in the chat, by the way, Robin shared. I remember the book of the name, but it's Ray Kurzweil, and I'm doubly embarrassed because I was on a board with his son. I couldn't remember his name, but they're really awesome books. If you want to see a futurist basically talk about this, and Ray, I think, currently works as a top thinker on AI at Google right now. All right. So this is the AIO shit gap, as I call it, basically, is the everything is going faster. The reality is also that we have a countervailing force. There's something that's pulling us back, which is the law of diminishing marginal returns, which, again, I told you this was an economics class, where you get to the point that you can actually generate relatively fast returns with little effort, but it starts getting more and more difficult, and the incremental investment to get slightly higher becomes dramatically higher over time. So let me give an example. I don't want to pick on Elon Musk too much, but I think he promised us full self-driving in 2017. And I think the reason was that he was also thinking linearly at the time, assuming he wasn't just flat out lying, but meaning that he saw linear improvement. It was very easy to get from 0 to 99%. And linear extrapolation is we're going to be at 100% and we can launch this thing relatively soon. The reality is that when you start getting from 99% to 99.9%, it may be 10 times harder. To get from 99.9 to 99.99%, it's yet 10 times harder. So this is, I think, a very brutal reality around improvement and how much effort it actually takes. So some of the exponential curve growth we see may be slowed down, I would say, especially for critical systems. And what I mean with that is that if you're developing an AI system that does poetry, video, whatever, it's not life critical. If you have, it's maybe 3 nines may be good enough and you've achieved your objective. If you're developing a self-driving system for a car, it may have to be 6 or 7 nines before it's socially acceptable that there are failures that could result in people dying. So, this is an area where I think it's also kind of it's not talked about that much in AI, but I do believe that the super enthusiasm we're seeing about money being plowed into AI by the tens of billions right now is a reflection of wanting to be on the exponential curve. But my conservatism is that the law of diminishing marginal returns applies to everything. So there's going to be potentially a lot of wasted money in this. And you'll see towards the end here, there's also this area called negative returns, where if you throw too many resources at something or the system is already hyper optimized, you can actually screw it up by putting more into it. Any case, so let's go to the next slide here. Accelerationism. So what is this? We haven't even talked about security yet. So how does this apply to security when we talk about AI? And I think temporarily, AI capabilities, just like the LLMs that we see out there and the ability to automate using APIs against them, I actually think it gives it maybe a temporary advantage to the bad guys. The reason I say that is because in my dark past, when I was doing individual contributor work, I did a lot of pen testing. I developed my own pen testing tools, did all kinds of horrible, evil stuff. And it's like, so my inner like black hat when I saw all of these tools, like, oh my God, if I only had this X number of years ago when I was doing this type of work, I could have been so freaking evil and so much more efficient. It's like, I think it's actually incredibly amazing how you could leverage some of these tools to say, for example, look up and build relationship diagrams in a company using open source data from LinkedIn and automate phishing attacks and things like that, or automatically, and we're seeing a fair amount of this, basically reverse engineer patches to identify new attacks that's happening at a much faster rate, or just automating the process of finding new zero days that weren't even known about, and and like creating your own attack. So there's a lot that can be done to the bad guys, um, by the bad guys, sorry. And the second point I want to make is that it is, human history is all about an arms race between technology. I mean, if I think back, I'm not a historian, but if I think back around like the Mongol horde sweeping all through Europe, they had technology the Europeans didn't have. Small, agile horses, lightweight armor, composite bows that ranged them, different tactics, etc. But that gave them a temporary advantage that really allowed them to just sweep in and cause a massive amount of damage across the world. So the nature of it is, whether we like it or not, it's like we do have to understand the adversary has similar access to these tools as the defenders do, and they're going to use them. They're going to use them to great effect. And I think you can actually be more creative in creating new attacks with AI than it's going to be much harder to detect those with similar AI systems. The bottom line is like, I don't know where we're at in that race. I don't know if truly the attackers are winning or the defenders are winning. The key point I have with the car crash here is that if you're standing still, if you're not reevaluating the product mix you have and trying to understand how am I putting in place kind of like the next generation tools that allow me to keep up with the next generation attackers, if you're just standing still, you're kind of dead. You're going to have a big train wreck right here. So, this is why the slide's called acceleration, is everybody is forced to accelerate from where we've been, meaning that technology refresh cycles and vendor selection, all of these things are just going to become more and more important over time because you don't have the ability of doing nothing. So moving to other things. So when we think about like AI disrupting cyber, it's frankly, it's all about the data. Data is gold. And we've seen so many startup companies that say we're going to suck everything in and we're going to do wonderful things with it. And we'll talk about some of those later. But data is gold for AI, but data is now also exposed at a different level. I already mentioned that from the control element, certain things like fine-grained access controls may actually disappear. And when you put all of this data into an AI, or at least they might if you don't pay attention to it. So I would say, if you're a CISO listening to this, pay attention to what are the true data assets and how are we actually making sure that we still maintain control over those data assets. We aren't just basically inadvertently sharing them through whatever the AI models are that the business is putting out there. So, to flip back to that is basically a key element that goes along with it is also discovery. Is like, I think now's the time more than ever to basically build the discipline of having systemic data discovery, which is going out there and understanding what are all the data elements that you have, what are all the systems and whatnot. And quite frankly, also engaging in discovery around the AI systems that are currently in use, because whether you like it or not, they're all accessible and probably available via credit card. So, this is an area where, if you're not doing something, you're probably setting yourself up for a really bad surprise from a breach of regulation perspective. Um, Connectivity and the volume. I think the volume has become absolutely staggering. And if you look at kind of like the article on the right-hand side, this is Mark Zuckerberg. They open sourced their Llama model, and because they kind of believe that the model itself is not the competitive differentiator. The competitive differentiator is going to be the data that is being used to train the model, which is obviously proprietary to Meta, Facebook, and whatnot. That also begs a very interesting question that I'll do a bit of a sidebar on, which is like, geez, it's like open sourcing an AI model that's that powerful. It's maybe kind of like publishing the blueprint for a nuclear bomb and basically saying, hey guys, we think the world's going to be a better place if everybody can build their own nuclear bomb. Here you go. Here's the blueprint. Please don't abuse it. So I'm still scratching my head around. Generally, I'm a-okay with open source, but I'm not sure that was fully thought through around the downside and the risks of open sourcing these very sophisticated AI models. And like I said, now the attackers is like, this is kind of awesome. I get to like do my attacker model basically, and all I have to do is train it with all of my darknet data whenever I want to. So I was like, So we'll have to see what happens there. Okay, begone humans. The bots are here. Um, this is interesting. I'll go to the diagram first, and this is from NIST, and I think it's 1 or 2 years old. And we've had the same basic argument probably for the last 10 years or so, which is cybersecurity is a human skills shortage. Meaning that we have to go out there, we have to train people, we have to create cybersecurity programs, we have to basically build army of cybersecurity analysts, et cetera. And that's kind of what even NIST is saying. And like I said, I think it's 1 or 2 years old. I'm not so sure that's so true anymore. Because if you think about, especially what these models are really great at, and especially what entry level jobs are being trained to do, entry level jobs around this are being trained to like follow a process and do the research. And I honestly think that a lot of them may be automated away in the next few years. So, it's clear there's a negative social downside associated with all of this. And that folks that were promised a bright career in cybersecurity by taking a security operations degree program, they may be kind of in trouble in the next few years. I think what's going to happen is that if you're the individual that's generating IP, if you're the trainer of the model, for lack of a better term, because there's a creative element that I hope machines will never match us in, but if you're that creative individual that's coming up with new attack methods, defenses, detection algorithms, you name it, basically, your job is going to be, I think, very secure because you're the ones that's going to be not just like 10x from an efficiency perspective in terms of enabling, but 100x or 1000x when you're able to take your creative thinking, codify it in the form of an AI, and then allow it to spread around the world in a way and do its job. Uh, yeah. So I did want to mention here a couple of companies, and unfortunately, I was a very poor VC because on the prior slide I skipped the two companies I have here, but I did want to mention them real quick around data, the data problem. One of them is Auguria. They're actually sitting as a pre-filter in front of your SIM environment, whatever it may be. And what they actually do is leverage various AI capabilities to analyze all of the logs that are coming in, all of the signal that you have. And what they do is they basically do a scoring on it, like a risk scoring, to identify, is this actually relevant from a security operations perspective, or is it just a bunch of log noise that we can archive away? So they can basically split the data pipe and make sure that the signal that's getting to the SIM and to the AI systems on the back end is actually relevant and not like 90%. Literally, they're seeing like 90% noise from a log volume perspective that they're able to reduce. The other one you see here is Big ID, which is actually a more mature company that we invested in our Clear Sky fund, which is started out as data privacy, but now is really broadened to everything around data discovery, control, and whatnot. If you have a complicated data problem, these guys are the ones to take a look at. And over here, basically, I also have a couple of companies that I want to mention. One of them is Tuskera. They're in stealth right now. They have a couple of design partners, but what they've built is actually a security data lake where everything is put into it. And then what they've built, they're building AI on top of the security data lake directly with multiple use cases. But the first one is actually to go through and utilize the AI to model all of the relationships within your environment based on what we're seeing about logs and event and configuration information, all of the discovery data they have. And then from that, being able to model basically what the attack paths would have to be, where can we cut off an entry point and maybe not have to patch 100 patches on the back end, which ones are even relevant. They're even going so far as right now to reverse engineer automatically. Like if there's a new Metasploit exploit that's being published, they reverse engineer that and they identify, well, what is this thing actually doing using an LLM? They do this. And then what they do is they can actively reconfigure your existing infrastructure to actually protect you from that attack before a patch may even be available, which is super cool. So they're really kind of at the forefront of innovation of leveraging LLM technologies on top of a large security data lake to try to create that agentic automation of defense for the enterprise. And Conifers is it's more tactically focused at the security operations center. So what they're actually doing is they are sitting on top of the Sims again, and they have built agentic again is the key word. And seriously, I was joking with my colleagues. We should start a drinking game that anytime somebody says the word agentic, you have to take a shot of tequila because it's like agents doing stuff is just the thing right now, and that is the term that's been coined. But what they do is they have a number of security agents. They're not all LLMs. Some of them are more expert models. Some of them are very sophisticated LLMs, but they have the ability, for example, to automate the entire workflow for investigating a phishing attempt, all the way down to, say, they've built a special model that can reverse engineer PowerScript and identify whether it's malicious and what it's doing, et cetera. So, very flexible architecture where rather than thinking about the AI in this case as one monolithic super brain in the sky, they've broken it into subject specific modules that solve more narrow problems very, very competently. All right. That's enough of a sales pitch there. Um, so back to the racing analogy. It's like the other thing is that governments aren't blind to this. Everybody is scared to death around how is AI going to change society? Who's going to lose jobs? You've heard about universal basic income being proposed and how some of those experiments have failed. So there's no clear answer what's going to happen when AI comes in and actually transform a lot of the white collar jobs by eliminating them. So there are regulations coming out across the board, in the EU, the United States. This is actually an output from Claude AI when I asked them what all the regulations are that they're working on internationally. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The bottom line is that it's going to be a minefield. It's going to be worse than data security ever was. And it's going to drive a focus on governance, making sure you actually understand what AI elements the business is using, being very close to the regulators, and making sure, again, you build these trust functions. And the reason I have Cranium here, this is another one of our portcos where when we think back 2 years after, my partner Jay and I first saw kind of like the demo of ChatGPT, and it's like, holy shit, this is going to change everything. We thought through it, and we were thinking that, what, everybody and their grandmother is going to, at the enterprise level, going to put in place some kind of AI program. We're going to transform our business with AI because just like we had from the kind of like the prior slide around the attackers, it's warfare between competitors, basically. It's like if you're not going to do it, you're going to get eaten alive. That's the bottom line. So we actually worked with Jonathan Dambrot, who at the time was incubating this company inside of KPMG. And rather than focusing on some kind of esoteric, we're going to prevent attacks against AI from nation states, blah, 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 it had a much cleaner focus that's more universal, which is how do you build governance and controls and oversight and basically rationality. So as everybody's running to implement AI in the enterprise, that you've created kind of like the ability for them to do that without getting hurt, without slowing down the desire of the business to implement AI. So if that resonates with you, I would say definitely take a look at Cranium. They're on the cutting edge of that. And lastly, I even think we may have some folks from Halcyon here, but this slide is like, this is your tax dollars at work. This is actually lifted from an FBI presentation in February or so. And I just thought it was so cheesy. I had to use it because the gun coming out of the monitor, it was like, that's okay, your tax dollars at work. But nevertheless, if you look at ransomware, basically, estimated $59 billion impact globally in 2022. Obviously, we don't have the 2023 or 2024 numbers, but this shit ain't slowing down. The bottom line is like, if I were a bad guy, I would be in ransomware. This is the cleanest business model ever. You go directly from code to monetization via cryptocurrency. It's really an amazing business model. And the profitability of this is staggering. So, it's like if the Russians are going to do it, somebody else is going to do it. It's not rocket science. So this stuff isn't going to go away. And, everybody's out there saying, well, we're going to protect you against ransomware because your security vendors have to tell you that. But the reality is that I would imagine that every single one of those companies that was compromised probably had a McAfee Symantec something already running on their systems that didn't quite live up to the promises of protecting them from ransomware. So, Halcyon is super interesting in the sense that it was purpose built to be an anti-ransomware company. meaning that it's also full spectrum. It does protection, detection, response, and recovery. Basically, the only thing it doesn't do is backup. But to give you an example, they went so far as to write very deep kernel level modules that monitor cryptographic functions on the system. And they will actually pull encryption keys out of memory and archive them just in case, if that is a piece of ransomware and it happens to get through, you have a magic undo button that you can now have the cryptographic key and you never have to pay the payment and you can undo the damage. And they're also doing really innovative stuff now that the attackers have moved away from just encrypting the data, but just stealing it and holding it for ransom. That they're also doing network level monitoring, looking for patterns of data exfiltration from systems. And they've already used this to basically catch insiders, not necessarily ransomware, but definitely insider use cases. So constantly innovating in their ability to help protect and recover on this. But yeah, the bottom line is basically if you're a CISO, think about, do I really have a comprehensive ransomware strategy? And should I be looking at something beyond our core vendors? Because all those companies that are out there that have been compromised, I'm sure if you go to them, they're going to have all the nice logos of the security vendors you've all known, heard about, and loved. Any case, so I'm going to wrap it up a little bit early, and I'd love to open it up for questions here if anybody has any.
So Patrick, I've got one that I think we've discussed a few times. What are you looking for from an investment perspective for these emerging technologies that are still in stealth mode, about to emerge?
I think so. I can mention AI is kind of a feeding frenzy. Okay, so everybody kind of has to have an AI story. Not everybody, but most of them do, because I do think AI is going to change the security industry. That said, how good is that story? How differentiated is it? I mean, we've seen a number of pitches. The majority of them are going, and we're doing something, something LLM to do something, something summary. And it's like, it doesn't feel deep and it doesn't feel defensible. So, what we're looking for is number one, knowledge and depth in cybersecurity. Um, we're not big believers in investing in individuals that haven't been operators in cyber or haven't worked in the space. So we tend to shy away from, really smart, Stanford or MIT kid doing something, but with no expertise, basically no work expertise. They may do something absolutely brilliant, but the risk of them building a product that's going to go to market and scale well in the enterprise is really high. And so and part of my data point around that is like I see some technologies being reinvented every couple of years. And for example, in the late 1990s, there was the first introduction of enterprise rights management, basically a bunch of encryption and controls over printing and copy and paste for files and blah, blah, blah. It didn't go anywhere in the 1990s. And then it was reintroduced in the 2000s. And, like even Microsoft and Adobe have it as part of their portfolio of capabilities, but nobody really deploys it. And then it literally is like every few months I see a new company starting up and they're trying to do the same thing. So it's kind of a head scratcher that we actually see uh, smart people, well-meaning people that haven't done their historical homework to figure out that some of these business models have been tried over and over again and they failed, and yet they still keep trying and looking for funding. Maybe AI can change some of those and make it viable, but I think in many of these cases, it's usability trade-offs as much as anything else, where you have to take the human element into play, and maybe AI can solve that. So I went down a rabbit hole on kind of like the negative side of things. What we do like to see is obviously very strong quantitative skill set in the team. We like to see a CEO who is, frankly, a really good leader, who's well-rounded, who has expertise in bringing products to market. I think that's extraordinarily important. I think the cliche and the venture investing space is it's all about the team. I mean, you can get the product wrong, you can pivot a few times and still come up with a great company, even though the likelihood decreases with every pivot. Um, but the team is really what matters the most. And even if I think back about some of our investments that were not the greatest, it generally comes down to we look back on it and we kind of go, yeah, we probably didn't do our homework in the team as much as we should have. Um, but yeah, on the AI side of things, it has to be defensible in some way. I mean, you can leverage like an existing LLM, like a GPT-4, whatever it may be, to build on, but it has to be defensible from a data perspective, or there has to be something that prevents the next smart competitor from coming in with 50 cents in his pocket and basically doing the same thing that you are. So it's like a clever idea is not enough. There needs to be, I would say, especially in this market, brutally fast execution. So it's all a race. So that, once you've been given the money, you're out of the gate and you're racing, you're spending that money wisely, you're creating a distance between yourself and the competitor. And hopefully that's based on something like data that's going to be difficult for the competitor to be able to get access to. I don't know if that was specific enough, Robin. Is that
No,
what you're
that
looking
great
for?
answer. No, absolutely. So I guess the follow-on question there is, do you feel that innovation is being stifled as the security industry trends toward these platform plus plays, similar to what you were alluding to earlier in your conversation around those monolithic vendors that just, acquire technologies, don't innovate, and then eventually sunset them or let them die on the vine? Are we heading in the same direction with Broadcom's, Palo Alto, Cisco, Fortinet roll-ups that we're seeing left, right, and center over the last
Eh,
24 months?
I'd like to say no. They all have very unique cultures. But for them, and again, you kind of mentioned on the ones that maybe not have the greatest reputations for ongoing innovation and sunsetting products. It's like, look, what is the old joke? CA, where good companies go to die.
Yep.
Um, that's still the case. You can replace CA with a couple of other vendors out there. I'm not going to say who I think they are, but yeah, but that's on the low end. And clearly, as an investor, if you sell a company to one of those, that's not going to be a significant outcome from a valuation perspective. And these companies are expert at basically milking existing customer relationships and stale technology to generate profits. And they do a very good job at that, up to the point that they piss off customers, but they've built in switching costs and whatnot to make it difficult. That's not something that interests me, but they're never going to innovate. Quite frankly, they will, but in a buyer's market like we have right now, you may actually see that they acquire some pretty interesting IP that may actually be a higher quality than what we saw in the past because it may be cheap for them to be able to do so and to get some value out of it. So nothing negative. We need those buyers in the marketplace as well because not everybody can give you kind of like X hundreds of $1 million exit on your startup investment.
Yep.
Uh, but what we're going to see is basically, I do think that there are very strong natural acquirers in cybersecurity. CrowdStrike, Palo Alto, Zscaler,
Mhm.
Wiz is in the acquisition path right now, and these companies they have a long time to go, and they will pay premium prices for amazing strategic fit and great teams and great technology. And some of them, like again, I'm going to positively pick on CrowdStrike. They've really maintained a very strong culture of innovation still, in a way that really, really impresses me. It's actually kind of threatening, to be honest, because they continue to actually just develop a really great product. Case in point, we sold a company called Preempt Security to them,
Mhm.
and within, I think they spent 2 years or so, don't quote me on the actual number of months, just basically integrating the product into kind of like their core Falcon offering. And once that work was done, they turned it on and they offered it for customers. And so it grew from a company when we sold it around 5 to 6 million ARR to like over 200 some odd million or 300 million ARR. Again, I suck at numbers memorizing them, but it's a dramatic benefit for them to acquire the company. And the reason I mentioned them positively from a culture perspective as well, from an innovation perspective, is that when I go back to that, the cycle about entrepreneurs quitting after a couple of years and leaving, because generally they hate being in large companies. That's why they were
Mhm.
entrepreneurs to start with. CrowdStrike's not like that. They actually retained the vast majority of the Preempt team, including both of the co-founders. They're still very happy there. So, I mean, I sound like I'm gushing, but I'm also trying to say there are outliers to kind of the inevitability that large cybersecurity companies are not able to innovate and not able to have cultures that retain high talent. So, but obviously, I say that it's kind of threatening because if large companies actually ever figure this stuff out, then maybe innovation in small companies is less of an issue. In which case,
Mhm.
that's not great for the VC environment because we exist to basically feed new technology, new innovation into kind of that big fish eat small fish ecosystem.
Appreciate the response there. We frequently, in the industry joke about some new company that comes out coming up with a feature that is just going to get acquired by another larger company. So for the folks that are on the phone who are the decision makers and actually have the spending authority, are there any outliers, in your opinion, Patrick, that bear consideration who might fall into that particular category before they get snatched up by, some of the larger corps or organizations?
Okay, so I'm not sure I quite understood that. Can you repeat that for me?
Yeah. So we frequently joke about how, these emerging tech companies come out with products that we think, could be just features that get rolled up eventually into other larger organizations, CrowdStrike, Palo, S1, Zscaler, et cetera. Are there any portfolio companies or companies that you're aware of that might be worth considering in that emerging tech space versus being part of those larger monolithic portfolios that the decision makers and folks that can spend money on this call may want to go and actually take a closer look at, even though they're just emergent at this point?
I mean, if I talk about some of our companies, like I already mentioned, like Auguria, for example, it sits there as a pre-filter for the SIMs. It's like
Yep.
right now, that's an amazing feature that's going to save a lot of like resources and improve the signal to noise ratio. But
Mhm.
it's also something clearly, if you think about it, it's like why wouldn't a SIM vendor want to acquire that company?
Absolutely.
Because it's an amazing defensive capability, especially let's say, for example, and I'll say this, Cisco recently invested and they obviously own Splunk, but, Splunk is being attacked from every angle possible, basically. So in continuing to invest in Splunk to basically make it a long-term number one choice for being a SIM basically is very strategic for them. So um, we do think about a lot of these innovative companies, they're all by the nature of them is going to be a feature, by the way, or at least in the beginning. They're going to have a vision, they're going to want to grow broader. But the reality is they need to be really, really good at least one thing. And the likelihood that within, the first 5 years of existence, they're going to be acquired by somebody who really wants that feature. If the entrepreneur does their part and we have the right vision as investors, that's the likely outcome statistically. Very few security companies actually make it to maturity in terms of going public. When's the last time you saw a cybersecurity company go public? It doesn't happen very often. Most of
Mhm.
them are acquired either by private equity or by other larger cybersecurity companies or by vendors that just want to enter kind of like the security space by building their own set of capabilities. And on the acquisition side, I forgot to mention Microsoft, but I think by dollar revenue, I think they're the largest cybersecurity company in the world, which is mind blowing. So yeah, everybody's out there and they're looking for these companies. And I would say that the majority of them is like, we can't predict. We can't predict, is this going to be a feature company that's going to be sold in 2 years? Is it something that is going to gain a breadth of capabilities where they are going to themselves be a mini platform or eventually grow into a platform? Or are they going to break through and eventually go public? If we do the right things as investors, which is investing fundamentally in a team that we think is going to be able to scale, is adaptive, that can grow, we have great engineering ability and agility in the team, then it's like we'd like to think that all of our companies at some point in time could go public. It's unrealistic, yeah, but it's like we're not building companies to sell them early on. The reality, though, is that if you're building a really great company, there are going to be some very tempting offers coming in without you asking, basically, to get that company acquired.
All right, we got a couple questions from the panel here. The first one, this is from an anonymous attendee. I know it may differ and slowly become faster and faster with more innovation, but how long is the timeline to create a new solution and get it to market?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, the asterisk of the caveat there is like quality or meaningful. There's an adjective missing basically. To create a new solution, you can go to Auto GPT and say, code me up the following thing. And I think now, there are entire frameworks where it'll actually build the infrastructure for you and host it for you automatically. So you just basically go through iterative refinement of telling it what you want it to do. So the opportunity here is, let's say, for example, you are an expert in um, the wastewater and valve industry, and there is a cybersecurity requirement from a compliance perspective, and you know this better than anyone else on the planet. your ability of going out there and taking your knowledge, maybe process-oriented knowledge, and utilizing Gen AI to basically build a product around that has never been better. You may not even have to hire anybody. You can just like sit in your, apartment for a weekend and say, build me the application. I'm going to do a brain dump here and tweak this thing until I know it solves the problem that I've been paid to do for or paid to solve for the last 20 years. You can find a ready market for yourself. And, it's like off you go, basically. It's like, I think it's never been easier to be an entrepreneur with zero resources than today because of generative AI capabilities. Um, the flip side is that if you're going to do a meaningful company, meaning that it's not just narrowly targeted and like process automation, it's still going to require heavy lifting. It's going to require you to hire a team of individuals, and it's going to require you to have potentially significant cost on the AI infrastructure. You could argue that the amount of money that's being spent on AI, it kind of may be similar to the old gold rush in the 1800s in California, where the only people who really got rich were the people selling pick shovels and blue jeans, basically. That's all TBD, but I hope that's not the case. Nevertheless, so it's like you can, if you build a company using generative AI technologies, it is going to be much easier, but you will have to have the right skill sets in your team that know how to leverage these tools. So I would challenge if you're an entrepreneur, basically going through the folks that you have and asking us like, how are we leveraging these capabilities? Are we seeing improvements? Who's doing things manually? And by the way, please collect your final paycheck if you're doing something manually. And who's actually adding value by continuously improving automation and leveraging various AI tools to try to put themselves out of the job so they can do something better. It sounds really brutal, but I think that's the reality because at the end of the day, it's about
Yep.
speed of execution and efficiency of resource consumption. And the resource consumption is when you're funded as a startup company, it's like you're basically born to die. It's like you have a clock that's ticking, and every dollar that's spent takes you one day closer to your death. And so you need to make sure to minimize the burn and maximize the speed that you're working at. And so I don't know if I'm answering the individual's question here. So it's never been easier. If you're an expert in a very narrow area, you can probably build a company and build an amazing lifestyle business by yourself by automating what you know and what you've learned over the last 20, 30 years. Uh, Otherwise, if you're building a broader platform, make sure you have the right skill sets and you really hold them accountable.
All right, well said. I think you definitely covered it. And to go back to one of your previous points, if you're not racing, you're dead. And that applies here too. Second question, and this one is a little bit tangential to AI, is do you have any vertical or horizontal areas of focus that you think need to be recognized that impact the evolution of AI? It looks like George is asking about power supply and demand, rare earth minerals, impact on the environment.
Oh boy.
Yeah, that's a little bit
I
broad.
yeah, no, no, no. I actually just remembered that I skipped a slide in my presentation, unfortunately. Um, so are there verticals? I'm more concerned around verticals that have high dependency on third parties from a technology perspective. And here's where I'm going. If I look at, let's say I used to run security for Dropbox and Salesforce. The vast majority of our platform was code that we control. There was no room for vendors. It was all highly customized. And in our operational environment, basically, if we need to fix something or do something, we do it, basically. And it's all developer driven. Whereas if I rewind, I look at my job at, say, Kaiser Permanente, I had virtually zero developers. And I was beholden to vendors doing the right things and providing patches and our teams to basically go out there and run around and apply them on the IT side and on the OT side and whatnot. So I'm picking on healthcare. I'm going to come back to the original question here a little bit, but the problem is exactly that dependency. And what I'm concerned about is like in a world that's accelerating, if you're a tech company where you own your code and you can integrate AI tools into code checking and fixing, and the slide that I forgot to talk about was actually that and I'm sure Stuart talked about this as well, basically, is like the complete automation of the life cycle, self-healing code, where if you have access to the code, you can, in the CI/CD pipe, assess it for vulnerabilities, automatically generate patches, apply those, test those, and on you go. You can actually generate that velocity from a defensive perspective that you need to keep up with the attackers. Okay. If you're dependent on third-party vendors that are small mom and pop shops that are doing embedded systems to drive an insulin pump, or that is some weird little company that's doing a valve controller that's made in China. And it's like those third-party dependencies prevent you from being agile. It doesn't matter how good you are, is my point, basically. When you have these third-party dependencies, you're kind of set up to fail. I hate to say it. So companies that control their own code, I think you're going to be fine. You can invest in the DApp. Everybody else, I think we're going to have to think differently. I think it's going to have to be strategies around how do you compartmentalize those assets, do real zero trust, not just from an end user perspective, but on the back end, every asset and how it talks to each other. There are a bunch of different adaptive strategies. In terms of kind of like specific industries, I don't know, but I went down this rabbit hole because I do kind of know healthcare a bit. And I know that I honestly don't see a nice light on the horizon for healthcare because they're beholden to such a patchwork of vendors, many of them very small and not very responsive. Um, in terms of like rare earth metals and things like that. And it's like, man, I'm a bit of a nerd, but so it's like it's an area that concerns me greatly from a national defense perspective. I think I read somewhere that it's like the last titanium mine in the U.S. was shuttered because we just kept importing it, and now we're dependent on China to provide titanium, which is a critical metal for the defense industry. Don't know if that's true, if that was propaganda. If it's true, it's really horrible. So I'm a big fan of like reestablishing domestic manufacturing and mining capability in the United States. I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen there for us to be, I would say, more of a stable, self-sufficient country. Boy, I just went down a separate rabbit hole. Sorry for doing that, Robin.
No, it's okay. I think that's exactly the direction that George was asking around. So
They need
appreciate all the
help.
questions,
And
folks.
yeah, yeah.
All right. Any other parting thoughts, folks? Okay. We'll wrap it up a couple minutes early. Patrick, thank you very much for giving us the lens of both the CISO as well as the investor. For those of you that are interested in some of these emerging tech companies, we are design partners with Agaria as well as Conifers. So happy to share, some of that detail with you as well. And I'm sure their founders would love to speak to you too. So thanks again, Patrick, for making the time. And we'll share this presentation on the site as well as the recording.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it,
I have
everybody.
no idea who was on this call. If you want to reach out on LinkedIn, say you saw me on the call. I'd love to continue the conversation individually if anybody wants to. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.